Okay, welcome to Com382's lecture on ethics. We're going to first look at the module outline, what we're going to cover. If you want to pause and use this outline for your notes, go ahead. We'll do this with every session, that you'll just look through the module outline to kind of guide you as we go through the lecture. So what do we mean when we say ethics? When we talk about ethics just in our lives, we mean these standards of conduct in our own lives that help us distinguish right from wrong. So you might say, oh, that was an ethical dilemma. I had to make a tough ethical choice. That person was behaving ethically. That person was behaving unethically. So this is a term that we use in our day-to-day existence, but with research ethics, these are ethical standards that apply to the process of conducting and reporting research. So when we talk about research ethics, they come from a variety of places. People can just have their own personal ethics, so a researcher's own set of values that guide their research. So, maybe some people are more committed to fairness than others, or are more interested in an ethics of care. And these may or may not overlap with laws or policies or professional ethics guidelines that researchers have to follow. So for the most part, it's usually researchers that are going beyond what is required of them in the ethical judgments that they make within their research. There's also professional codes of conduct within professional organizations. So if a professor is a member of the American Psychological Association or the International Communication Association, as a member of those organizations, there are ethical guidelines that people, when they become members, say that they will adhere to. There's also procedural ethics. These are sort of the bureaucratic ethics. These are laws and regulations and policies within an institution, like the rules regarding ethical behavior at the University of Washington, or within a state, or within a country. When we're thinking about social justice research in particular, we know that the value systems that people have are something that they grow up with and they develop over time. And people that have certain values towards honesty or equity or fairness, this impacts the decisions that they make as researchers. And often when people are engaging in social justice scholarship, their personal values are part of the decisions that they're making. So this could influence things like what topics people are studying, what methods or theories they include, who they cite and reference in their literature review, who do they work with, who are the participants in the study, how research participants are treated, how the research is written up, etc. So, and also the impact of the research, that beyond just having it published, did it make an impact in that community? So if we step back a little bit and talk about the history of research ethics, it's really unfortunate, but a lot of the policies that we're going to learn about in this module are responses to really horrible things that happened in the past. And I'm going to talk about three really famous cases that are often brought up that really led to there being more formalized rules about ethics. So the Tuskegee syphilis study, it's possible you've heard of it before this class. Starting in the 1930s, over 40 years, the U.S. government was studying what happened when Black men in the United States had the sexually transmitted infection syphilis, but they did not treat them. They wanted to see what would happen if this disease just continues to take over someone's body and they don't have any sort of treatment for it. The people that enrolled in this study did not fully understand what they were getting into when they enrolled in the study. And you think about it, that you're basically looking at someone get sicker and sicker and potentially dying, and that they're suffering, and that they don't really know. The researchers said it's in the name of science, but this is incredibly harmful and just a terrible, terrible thing that the US government did. And this legacy matters today, that when the COVID-19 vaccine came out in 2021, there were some people who said that understanding the history of the government doing this Tuskegee syphilis study impacted decisions for people to get vaccinated or not, 100 years later. And so it really does have a long legacy. We also talk about the Milgram experiment in the 1960s. This guy here, Stanley Milgram, did a study, and you can see it in a video clip if you watched it before or after, where people were following directions, and they were told that they had to give electric shocks to people, and they could hear in the other room this person receiving this shock, even though in reality it was just an actor screaming. But you can imagine that those people sitting there, this really was damaging to them, that they thought that they were causing pain to people. So this, you watch the video because it's incredible to see, but this is another study that caused a lot of concern.
A decade earlier, psychologist Stanley Milgram had also looked at how we respond to authority. In order to understand how people were induced to obey unjust regimes and participate in atrocities such as the Holocaust, he set up an experiment. Volunteers were told they were taking part in scientific research to improve memory.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Where? Teacher.
Separated by a screen, the teacher would ask the learner questions in a word game and administer an electric shock when the answer was incorrect. He was told to increase the voltage with each wrong answer.
Cloud, horse, rock, house. Answer. Wrong. 150 volts. Answer, horse.
Oh. Experiment, that's all. Get me out of here. Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
You refuse to go on? The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue.
Participants didn't know that the learner was really an actor and the so-called shocks harmless.
You're going to get a shock. 180 volts.
Oh. I can't stand the pain. Let me out of
You
here.
can't stand it. I'm not going to kill that man, eh? I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman? I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please. All right, next one. Slow. Walk, dance, truck, music.
Two-thirds of volunteers were prepared to administer a potentially fatal electric shock when encouraged to do so by what they perceived as a legitimate authority figure. In this case, a man in a white coat.
375 volts. I think something's happened to that fellow in there. I don't get no answer. He was hollering for less voltage. Can't you check in and see if he's all right, please?
Milgram's findings horrified America. They showed that decent American citizens were as capable of committing acts against their conscience as the Germans had been under the Nazis.
And in the 70s, there was a study called the Stanford Prison Experiment. This was another psychological study where they took a bunch of people and they had them pretend that they were either prisoners or guards, and for 2 weeks the prisoners were really treated horribly by the guards and basically caused a lot of trauma for all of these people involved. So not good. But these are kind of the cases that they bring up, why you'll learn about we have these very strict rules for people engaging in research. It's also important to mention that it's not a coincidence that the increased concern about research ethics coincided with the social justice movements of the 1960s and 70s. That there was a broader societal conversation in the U.S. about human rights, people's dignity, etc. And so it all came together at the same time so that people could be thinking about what it means to be a research participant. So 4 big issues that came about from those studies I mentioned earlier. First is the potential harm that if people might experience physical or psychological harm from engaging in research and their personal safety is at risk. The next thing that came up was the idea of informed consent, especially tied to the Tuskegee study, that people should fully understand the research that they're getting involved in, and they should be able to make a rational decision to participate in the research or not voluntarily, that people need to know what they're getting into. Deception. This came up in all of those studies, that if researchers are intentionally lying or misleading participants, this is generally not considered okay. There are some exceptions to this that we'll talk about later. And also privacy, that participants should have the right to decide when, where, to whom, and to what extent their own personal information is revealed to others. So the Belmont Report came about that was studying about things that were going on in the U.S. within research studies, and reported that there should be guidelines that all research on people should follow. And there's 3 big ethical principles that underline the Belmont Report. And I should mention that basically this setup was copied or inspired in many other countries, that this isn't that exceptional, that nowadays pretty much this is the standard around the world. So we'll talk about each of these in detail, but respect for persons is basically the idea that people have autonomy and the freedom to decide what happens to them. Beneficence is that research should maximize benefits and minimize cost. Justice is that the benefits of the research should be fairly distributed, and the burdens or the downsides of research should also be fairly distributed. The Belmont Report and these principles are codified in the Common Rule, and any research basically that takes place at any American college or university has to follow these guidelines. So let's get into them. First one's respect for persons. Again, this is protecting the autonomy of all people and treating them with courtesy and respect, and specifically informed consent that we'll talk about in a minute. Researchers should be truthful and not deceive people. Individuals should be treated as autonomous agents who are capable of deliberation, basically decision making. That they should be given weight to their opinions and choices, and that researchers should not obstruct their actions. And part of this is that research participants, before they actually engage in the research, must be given all the information they need to fully decide if they want to participate or not, and that there should be no pressure to participate, and people should be given plenty of time to make a decision if they want to participate or not. We also have people who legally cannot make those kind of decisions because they have less autonomy. So for example, children, you remember when you were a younger kid, if you were going to participate in a bunch of things, your parents had to sign off on it. This is that same kind of idea, that basically children are not intellectually capable of making these decisions. So there's this category called vulnerable populations. Basically people who have diminished autonomy, that they can't freely make these decisions. And this could include if I, as your professor, asked you as my student to participate in research, I have power over you, and so I'm not allowed to do that. Now, this doesn't mean that none of this ever happens. People can be given the opportunity to choose to the extent that they're able, and consent can be also given by a parent or a legal guardian. So informed consent is part of Respect for Persons. You're probably already familiar with the idea of consent and its legal meanings. This idea is that research participants must be competent to consent. So they must understand, they must comprehend what they're reading. They have to agree, and it must be voluntary without being coerced into agreeing. The researcher has to tell the participant all the relevant information. So the study's purpose, what's going to happen during the research, is there any alternative to the proposed intervention, risk and benefits. Also, participants can change their mind and drop out at any time they want to. In your textbook, there is an example informed consent document. But in general, these documents always have this information. You can hit pause if you want to look at this in more detail, but it's also in your book. But it just basically covers everything that we just talked about and all the details. And we really do encourage people to read these fully. And if they have questions, that they can ask for clarifications. Beneficence is the next principle. And this is the basic idea of do no harm while you're maximizing benefits for the research project and minimizing risk for the research participants. You're really trying to make sure that you are securing the well-being of your research participants. How do you actually evaluate the potential harm? This is really tough, especially when you don't know what could happen in the future. So you have to first evaluate the level of risk to your participants and try to minimize the risk. They say that the risk should not exceed the risk that someone would encounter in their regular day-to-day life. So for example, if someone gets a paper cut on a paper, well, they might do that in regular life too. And then the risk of the research in relation to the benefits. So usually who benefits from research studies? Well, the researcher, because they get data and they can publish on it. The participants might benefit because they're getting paid to be in the research, or they are really committed to the topic of the study, so they want to be studied. But really, this risk and benefits assessment is the key to evaluating the ethics of a study. Another part of beneficence is making sure that you're protecting the privacy of your participants. So it's a little confusing at times, this idea of an anonymity versus confidentiality. I like to think of anonym. Nym in that word means name. And so think of anonymity has a name in it. Anonymity means that the participants cannot be identified. And in a perfect world, this is how we would always conduct research studies. But in reality, it's really hard. Sometimes it's possible if people are filling out surveys somehow on their own, like through the mail or something. But in reality, like if you're doing an interview with someone or they're coming to a lab to be in an experiment, you're going to interact with them and they have to say, hey, I'm so-and-so and I'm here for the study. So it's very hard to achieve this, so that you don't collect any information whatsoever that can be tied to identifying that person. So in an anonymous study like this, don't collect their name, their address, their email address, their student ID, their IP address. So in reality, though, more often than not, we engage in confidentiality. So that's a step down from anonymity, that data from participants are not shared with others without the permission of the participants. Only the researcher knows the identity of the participant and takes a lot of steps to protect that identity. So to do this, the researcher would remove names and other identifying information, keep the data in a secure place. This used to be in like a locked cabinet. Now it's more like a secure hard drive. Never using anyone's names or identifying details in reports, using pseudonyms, etc. And so sometimes in this you have to sometimes change some details, like if someone discloses that they are a really unique job, you'll have to change it. But it's important so that you are protecting the privacy of people and that people feel comfortable engaging in the research with you. Also, with beneficence, people engage in debriefing. This is especially common after an experiment. This is a short interview between the researcher and the participant at the end of the research study that they just sort of talk about what happened. It's a way to educate the participant about what happened. If a study involved deception, you absolutely have to do this, and that someone needs to be told exactly how they were deceived. The goal of that debriefing is that people shouldn't feel worse about themselves than before the study began. Justice is the third principle, and this is the idea that people are to be treated fairly. So the argument is that the risk and benefits should be distributed fairly without bias, and that research should not involve people who are unlikely to benefit from it. So an example here is that in the 80s, when researchers were working on drugs that would prevent the transmission of HIV from mother to fetus, they did a research study that half of the pregnant people were given a particular drug that would prevent transmission, and the other half were given a placebo, a fake drug. And they saw right away that the first generation of babies born did not have the HIV virus, and this was a big deal. And so they stopped the research study immediately, and they made sure that all the pregnant people in the study received the drug immediately. That it was such, an extreme situation that they wouldn't want to deny people. So when we're thinking about justice, we just want to make sure that there's not people who are losing out because they're participating in a research study. So how is this organized? Well, at any university or college, and some organizations as well, there's this thing called the Institutional Review Board, called the IRB. And this is an entity here at UW, that there's such an entity. And they review all the plans for research to make sure that the research being conducted is ethical. And you have to get them to approve all of your stuff before you can start your research study. So what does the IRB look at? Well, research is any sort of systematic investigation, including research, development, testing, and evaluation, that will design, develop, or contribute to generalizable knowledge. Human subjects mean living humans, about whom an investigator obtains data through an interaction or identifiable private information. So this also means maybe your course transcripts, right? Even if someone doesn't interact with you, it's identifiable that it's you. But at IRB, not every study goes through the full review. So I want to talk to you about, there's 3 levels. So the first level is exempt review, and this is if there's only minimal risk to humans participating. So for example, if someone was just going to do a basic experiment testing, source credibility of a particular news article, for example. That means that you have to go through the lowest level of IRB review. It usually will come back in about a week or so, and you only have to fill out a little bit of paperwork. Expedited review is sort of this middle ground, and these are often interviews and focus groups, studies that might involve some risk, but they're not like definitely traumatic. Full IRB review is anything that might traumatize people. And if you're doing any kind of study involving kids, prisoners, pregnant people, people who have any sort of cognitive impairment, etc. So even if you're doing a study with kids that's very simple, like I did a study during the pandemic with kids playing the video game Animal Crossing, and I had no idea, but it would take weeks and weeks and weeks to get the IRB to review all of our paperwork, because you have to show them everything. So those 3 levels are really by risk. It's also important to know about reflexivity, and this is a picture of me right after I graduated undergrad, I was working on a research project in Armenia. And this is, I don't know if I'm engaging in reflexivity in this moment, but just to bring about that it's about a researcher being aware of the cultural values and worldview that they're bringing into any sort of research study, and really thinking about at every single stage, how am I thinking about this and how could I be thinking about this differently? I'll give you an example. I did a study a couple years ago where I was interviewing young women who didn't use the internet in a culture that is not my own. And in my mind, I was thinking, oh, these young women, they're definitely being forced not to use the internet by their dads or their brothers or something. This is horrible. What a bummer. But I knew that I was carrying my assumptions as a woman from the United States and my beliefs about what women should be able to do and not be able to do. So when I went in and did my research study, I really had to be very conscious about the fact that I had this very different view. And as I interviewed these young women, I learned that in fact, a lot of them were choosing themselves not to get online. They said that it stressed them out, that they were getting harassing messages, that it was really a lot of work, that they got a lot of critiques, and it wasn't worth it for them to be online. And so while some of them did say their dad or their brother told them they couldn't be online, this was really eye-opening for me. And if I hadn't been engaging in reflexivity and I hadn't been open to what they were going to tell me, I probably would have never gotten their true story with their voices. So it's really important to be engaging, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about qualitative methods too. There's other ways to be more ethical and inclusive. So when people are collecting data, they have inclusive research samples that they try to go beyond the majority group to make sure that within a research sample they have diverse perspectives. Not engaging in tokenism. You're probably familiar with this term already, but just making sure that not just having like one woman member on the research team just so it's on the list. And also not engaging in deficit-based thinking, that framing minoritized groups as lacking and inferior compared to the dominant groups. And also making sure that research materials are culturally inclusive, that you're making things available in multiple languages and people from multiple perspectives.